Welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to go ahead and focus on anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is going to be probably one of your bigger chapters in the fact that these type of disorders are quite prevalent. And as you can see from this title screen, there's an awful lot of anxiety disorders out there, and we're going to get through most of them. But of course, that's going to take a little bit of time. So we're not going to do it all in one module. No, this will take a few. So in this very first module, what we're going to do is just talk a little bit about anxiety and its prevalence. Just like we talked about in last chapter, when you have mood disorders, you do have a high prevalence rate of anxiety. Those two, mood and anxiety, are probably the top two types of psychopathology or mental disorders that we see in the population. So let's go ahead and take a minute and look at the prevalence rate here. Now, according to the National Comorbidity Survey replication, this about 18% or almost 1 in 5 adults in the US have at least one type of anxiety disorder in a given year. So you can imagine this means that there is quite a bit of problems out there and issues in regards to anxiety. And I can tell you in my private practice, when I look at the referrals, even in children and adolescents, anxiety is by far one of the most common concerns. Usually, anxiety is going to precede the onset of depression. So if you remember last chapter, I talked a little bit about how depression is kind of a follow-up disorder in addition to maybe an initiator. And by that, what I meant is a lot of these other disorders can create the environment that's conducive to developing depression. And anxiety is no different, other than it's probably even more so for anxiety than some of the other disorders we'll be talking about this semester. So what we usually see that makes anxiety worse, as does depression, is this idea of stressful life events. And of course, the more stressful life events you have, the more the mental coping is stressed and more likely to give in to a variety of problems. Okay, so that's the prevalence rate. And like I said, odds are, even in our online class, we probably have at least 3 or 4, maybe even upwards of 8 people who are experiencing anxiety as is right now. So something that I wanted to spend a bit of time on because it is such a prevalent problem. So let's look at symptoms of anxiety. We're going to go through a first couple here in this module, and the next module we'll get the rest of them. But what we know is that people with anxiety disorders, they're preoccupied with and or persistently avoidant of thoughts, situations that provoke fear or anxiety. So they kind of fixate on them or try to keep avoiding these kind of issues. And so this is made up of real fear. And fear is, well, I shouldn't say anxiety is not made up of fear. Fear is usually experienced in the moment where there's real immediate danger. It builds up quickly in intensity, and it helps organize persons' kind of behavioral responses to a threat from the environment. In other words, it's pretty adaptive. When we are in danger, we need to rev up our hyper alertness and we need to organize our thoughts so that we can survive whatever that fearful situation is. So that's the fear. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is more diffuse in general than fear. So there are specific types of anxiety, that, like phobias, that are directed at a particular thing. But even that particular thing, it's kind of a idea of even expecting that thing to come. The anxiety is totally out of proportion with any threat from the environment. So when people get nervous about something and they just really start to kind of lose it, that is not necessarily probably what the situation warrants or merits. And so that's when we talk about somebody being anxious or overly anxious, that's out of proportion to the threat from the environment. So anxiety is kind of a 4-letter word, and I know not, but it's, kind of one of those things. Anytime people mention anxiety, it's associated with bad things. And I think the important thing to note is anxiety at low levels is actually very good. You want to have at least some level of anxiety in your life, otherwise you don't get things done. So, for example, if you had no anxiety about this class, you may not feel like you need to log in and watch these video modules or to do the assignments. You need a little bit of anxiety to spur you on to your best performance. The problem is in our society is we tend to have too much or excessive levels of anxiety, and that's maladaptive. And that's where we start talking about anxiety disorders. We also see that it is associated with pessimism and negative self-evaluation at higher levels. So when you have high levels of anxiety, people tend to be more pessimistic with future outcomes, and they tend to negatively evaluate themselves and other sorts of things. So rather than being directed anxiety at a person's present circumstances, which is what fear is really focused on, it's really associated with kind of a future oriented, like what could go wrong in the future. And of course, if you've ever played that game, it's not a fun game to play because you can always think of something that's going to go wrong in the future. Those bad self-evaluative thoughts I was mentioning earlier, this could be something like, if something bad happens, I probably won't be able to control it. Okay, that's that pessimism that's coming into. And so what you see with anxiety is that person's attention really turns inward, focusing on the negative emotions and self-evaluation as opposed to looking outward. And sometimes that can lead to some anxious apprehension. And that's what we look at when we talk about these kind of anxiety. There's the high level of diffuse negative emotions. Okay. There's a sense of uncontrollability. There's nothing I can do about it. And then there's a shift in that attention to the self focus or a state of self preoccupation. That's what we refer to as anxious apprehension. Okay. High levels of diffuse negative emotion, a sense of uncontrollability, and a shift in the attention to the primary self focus or state of self preoccupation. Getting into that uncontrollability, I got to tell you, the worst thing in regards to coping is feeling you have no control over a situation. That quickly leads to things like depression and anxiety. If at all possible, if you can see some little difference you can make into anything that you're anticipating or getting anxious about, that's much more empowering, less likely to spur the anxiety. So on this next slide, you can see kind of the vicious cycle of anxiety. So anxiety can lead to an increased scanning for danger. That's that hypervigilance. Your physical symptoms of anxiety, of feeling tense, starts to amplify. Your attention narrows, so you can kind of get almost what they call tunnel visions, and it's tunnel vision about yourself. And so then you start looking at ways to escape or avoid your current situation. The escape or avoidance usually relieves the anxiety. And so long term, you see an increase in the physical symptoms of anxiety. You see people worry more, they lose confidence about their ability to cope, and instead increasingly use their kind of safety behaviors, which is the escape or avoidance. And escape or avoidance eventually is going to catch up with you, or you're going to just start avoiding whole opportunities. So, like, with phobias, if it's like, oh, you're scared of pink bunnies, and you're like, oh, we're going to the fair, there may be a pink bunny there. I can't go with the rest of my friends because there could be a pink bunny. Okay, that's what they mean by this kind of vicious cycle of anxiety, because you get reinforced with the relief you feel when you escape or avoid something. But when that keeps happening, your world begins to get narrow and more narrow. Okay, so this is just part of the anxiety. In Module 2, we're going to discuss some more anxiety symptoms in greater detail, and then eventually we'll start getting into the variety of disorders that we can diagnose based on anxiety. So stay tuned for Module 2.